Late one night, in a house that seemed too quiet for its size, Sarah was alone, or at least she thought she was. The silence was heavy, unnerving, wrapping around her like cold chains. She felt something was watching her, though she couldn't place why. The feeling had been growing for weeks, like a sickness festering beneath her skin. It started innocuously, a reflection in her mirror at night, her own face peeking back at her, but slightly off. It wasn't immediately obvious, just a split-second delay. When she raised her arm, her reflection raised its arm just a heartbeat too late. She'd brushed it off, convincing herself it was her imagination. But the unease lingered, clinging to her like static. One evening, as Sarah brushed her teeth, she glanced at the mirror out of habit. Her reflection blinked slowly, her own eyes staring back at her. Yet something about the reflection's posture seemed wrong, almost too stiff, too rigid. It felt less like looking at a reflection and more like staring into the eyes of someone pretending to be her. The next night, Sarah stood in front of the mirror again, unwilling to admit that something was terribly wrong. She splashed water on her face, looked down, and as she straightened up, her reflection hadn't moved. Her hands were still by her sides in the real world, but in the mirror, her reflection's hands were raised, palms pressed flat against the glass as though trying to break through. The smile was there again, that unnatural, impossibly wide smile, and Sarah wasn't smiling. A sharp metallic scraping sound filled the room. She froze as the reflection's fingers slid down the inside of the mirror, nails dragging across the glass like claws. A deep, dark scratch appeared on the surface, running from the top of the mirror down to its base. But that wasn't the worst part. As Sarah stood paralyzed, her reflection's head began to turn. Slowly at first, the movement unnatural, as if the bones inside were grinding against each other. It turned and turned until the face was upside down, lips still curled in that terrifying grin, eyes wide and soulless. The reflection stared directly into her eyes, even though its head should have been pointed at the ceiling. Sarah stumbled backward, knocking over the bathroom shelf in her panic. Bottles clattered to the ground, but she barely noticed the noise. She bolted out of the bathroom and slammed the door shut, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But something in her head, a whisper she couldn't silence, told her it wasn't over. The mirror had seen her, and now it wanted her. Sarah stopped going into the bathroom at night. She left the lights on, the door shut, anything to avoid that awful mirror. But it didn't help. Soon, the strange occurrences spread to the rest of the house. It began with the hallway mirrors. She would pass by and catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye, only to look and see herself standing still. But it wasn't her. She wasn't moving, but her reflection was. Sometimes it waved, sometimes it just stood there, watching, waiting. Late one evening as she lay in bed, Sarah heard a soft creaking sound. The noise wasn't new. Her old house made all sorts of strange noises, but this was different. This creaking sounded deliberate, as though something, or someone, was walking down the hall. Step by slow, deliberate step, the sound moved closer. Sarah's heart thudded in her chest. She strained to listen, convinced she was hearing things. Then, her bedroom mirror rattled, just slightly, but enough to set her nerves on edge. She bolted upright, her eyes locking on the glass. The surface rippled like disturbed water, and she caught sight of her reflection. It was standing next to the bed, staring at her, the same grotesque smile spreading across its face. Panicked, she threw her blanket over the mirror, but the rippling continued. It was no longer just a reflection, it was something more. A sickening feeling churned in her stomach as the air in the room grew colder, the stench of rot and decay filling her nose. Sarah backed against the wall, desperate to flee, but the mirror wouldn't let her go. A week passed, and by then, Sarah was barely sleeping. She'd covered every mirror in the house, but the scratching sounds persisted. The whispers, too, had grown louder. The reflection was speaking to her now, though the words were garbled, like a voice calling from underwater. The mirror wanted her, called to her, taunted her with its horrible grin, but Sarah refused to answer. until the night she woke up to find the blanket torn off her bedroom mirror. She bolted upright, terror gripping her chest. Her reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. Instead, standing where her image should have been, was a puppet, a grotesque, lifeless figure dressed in tattered clothes, its wooden eyes locked onto her, lips painted into an eerie, knowing smile. She stared in disbelief, every fibre of her being screaming to run. But before she could move, the puppet tilted its head. Slowly, jerkily, it raised its hand. It was mimicking her again, only this time it wasn't in her control. The puppet's hand pressed flat against the glass, and a loud cracking noise echoed through the room. The glass didn't just crack, it shattered, shards flying outward, and yet the puppet remained intact. It stepped out of the mirror, joints creaking and groaning as it moved with an unnatural gait. The puppet's head twisted around to face her fully, its smile widening, its eyes locked onto hers. With each step it took, Sarah could feel her will crumbling, her body frozen in terror. The puppet extended its hand toward her, its fingers impossibly long and thin, nails scraping across her skin as it reached for her face. It grinned wider, eyes hollow and empty, but filled with a malicious intent that she couldn't escape. Sarah screamed as the puppet grabbed her wrist, its wooden fingers squeezing with inhuman strength. She felt herself being pulled toward the broken mirror, the edges sharp and glistening with her fate. She fought, but the puppet was too strong. Her reflection, the real her, was trapped in the broken shards, mimicking her movements with that same twisted smile. And then, with one final tug, Sarah was gone. It's behind you now, watching, waiting for the right moment. If you think you can escape, subscribe for more, but you won't outrun the next one.